From the deep woods now emerges Birna, Wardruna's sixth studio album. Through his never-resting dialogue with nature, Einar Selvik has been searching for the voice of the bear, our lost sister of the forest. Birna, the she-bear in Old Norse, is a work of art dedicated to the warden of the forest, nature's caretaker, and her battles here on Earth. Slowly driven out of her habitat by modern-day societies, she has entered a stage of permanent hibernation. As a result, the forest is gradually dying, longing for its pulse and heart, its shepherd. Birna calls for her return. Wardruna's discography is one of seeking. Each album, since the very beginning, has at once felt like its own individual search, while also being a part of a larger journey towards rediscovering something that's been lost. One can trace a trajectory throughout Wardruna's albums through to Hibjørnen, where I feel like the band really found its voice, blending that organic, raw world of folk music with the darker mysticism inherent in the medievalist pagan revival of the 21st century, and tied together with a developed confidence and consistency in songwriting and composition. The way I hear it, Wardruna's music has only become more organic and earthy over time. Yggdrasil had that characteristic wooden sound that carried over to the definitive style of Hibjørnen, with Skald's emphasis on minimalistic acoustic performance definitely playing a role here too. But even though it was indeed organic, Hibjørnen also had a coldness to it, as did all of their previous albums. A coldness that has defined Wardruna's sound in a lot of ways. Read any comments under any videos, read reviews of their albums, or even just look at the videos that they themselves make. There is a cold atmosphere that is definitely established in their music so far. And this coldness is not at all a bad thing. As a matter of fact, it's what draws a lot of us to Wardruna's music and that Nordic sound in general. But the reason I'm establishing a history or a tradition of a cold river running through Wardruna's music here is because Birna, to me, is defined by its warmth. Birna is a gentle giant. It has a softness in its demeanor that allows for the space for other emotions and expressions typically excluded from this style we often call dark folk. More than anything, as I listen to Birna over and over again, I'm taken in by a sensitivity, even a vulnerability, which runs through the record compared to that icier veil of earlier albums. It's a vulnerability which has made me, the listener, feel like I'm being spoken with rather than spoken to through the music, and welcomed me into a space to share in the catharsis. But make no mistake, much like the beast for which the album is named, the warmth of Birna does not sacrifice the teeth that Wardruna's music has shown now for over a decade. Writing this deep dive was a very daunting task, probably the most daunting of anything I've done here on the Nordic Sound. And it will shock none of you to hear me say that Wardruna is a band that I do hold in very high regard, not only as just a fan of good music, right, but also as a musicologist of Nordic music, and also a musicologist concerned with how music, this music, can play its part in the real issues facing us today, climate collapse more specifically. In this way, Wardruna is not only an ambassador of Norwegian and broader Nordic culture, though I know Einar doesn't feel like one, but they are also ambassadors of the environmentalism movement itself. It's a role they've had in the undercurrents, which became most explicit with Grau, until now this whole album seems to be what I called an animist manifesto many months back in my Himinndotter video. And because of the scope of this album and its message, it feels like there's still, even now, so much left to be said and uncovered as we sit with this album. All of this is to say that when Wardruna releases an album, it's a global event that brings people together across so many walks of life and so many spectrums for so many different reasons. And this beautiful unifying aspect of the music is what I'm going to be focusing on here in this deep dive into Birna, as I have done for many months now, starting with the very first video we got with Hertan. I'm making this not-so review so we can look into as many little nooks and crannies that this album has conceptually and musically, so we can better understand this music that holds so many of us utterly spellbound. But also, it would be just an impossible task to unturn every stone, and more ideas will surely even come up to me while editing this video. So please, as always, think of this video as the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of one. So without further ado, and after much anticipation, let's dive into Wardruna's newest album, Birna, the Gentle Giant. I don't believe it to be insignificant that the coldest and the most pained track on the album is what kicks it off. and instead I very much believe it to be intentional, having a lot to do with the message that Birna has to say. In dialogue with the earth and forest, we all start with pain. It reminds me of Aldo Leopold's World of Wounds. One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. An environmentalist must either harden his shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the mark of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. Beginning with that pain and vulnerability, this song about the heart, arguably the most vulnerable part of us, allows us and the record the sonic space to grieve and cathartically express the pain felt when looking honestly to the state of the world. In short, for this album to do any work in calling home the warden of the forest, we must first acknowledge the pain that's been inflicted. Musically depicted with the strained breathiness of Einar's opening chant, what I believe to be one of his most impressive vocal performances, which slowly fades into the heartbeat rhythm that drives the song, it's just a really intense piece that starts the album off running. I already talked more in depth about the musical components of this specific song way back in April when the single came out, so if you're interested in a more deep dive into that song in particular, go check out that video. Speaking of previous Wardruna videos here on the channel, in the review of Birna, the single that I did, I mentioned a point important to listening to the rest of the album from here. The kantele itself symbolizes the bear, and may even be compositionally intended to be the voice of the bear itself. But what I didn't talk about in that first video, because it needed the context of where it sits in the rest of the album to be noteworthy, is if we're going to continue the spectrum of old cold versus new warmth, we already see the chill of Hertan being shed off here in Birna. And of course, what feels like an increased presence of Lindy's voice throughout Birna, compared to past records, brings a light that makes the album shine. I really love her performance on this track and on the songs to come. She just brings the magic. So these next three songs, from Ljos to Jord, through Dvaledraumar to Jord to Ljos, together create what in music we call a cycle. Cyclic music is one of the oldest forms of large-scale music composition, and essentially means smaller pieces of music that are strung together with related themes to create one large, coherent work that often tells a story. In the case of Ljos till Jord through Jord till Ljos, it is also literally depicting a cycle of going into hibernation and then emerging out from that hibernation. I really love the chanting that opens this, again in 5/4, which I mentioned in previous videos, which creates that driving irregular pulse of the tune. And this is also a track that, at least in my ears, has the most influence from the general medieval pagan music scene of the early 2000s, like Faun, for instance. And lastly, the Tagelharpa line in this song is just insanely good. So this track is a huge highlight on the album for me. The building tension from Hertan through Ljos till Jord meets a long quiet leading into Dvaledraumar, broken by a simple, sleepy bukkehorn call over the sound of breaking or thawing ice. This has to be one of, if not the most ambient tracks that Wardruna's ever done, fitting for the subject matter of the tune being one of dreaming and deep hibernation. I love the way that the different instruments and parts here flow in and out to create the atmosphere of a deep dream. From the bukkehorn to the solo singing from Einar to a descending kantele line decorating gentle humming from Lindy, then the bowed strings to the male chorus, it's like the fading in and out of a deep sleep and into the subconscious, with the increased layering of sounds as the track goes on also feeling like a slow, steady awakening. The whole piece feels very much like a dream thanks to these compositional techniques. Which brings me to just how beautifully and artistically done it is to end this track with Lindy singing Lok, a musical calling, beckoning, or summoning, alongside the blooming birdsong and the seljefløte, the Norwegian willow flute, to musically depict the coming of spring at the end of this long meditative winter to transition into Jord till Ljos. A willow flute is specifically made from the new growth of the spring willow trees, if I understand correctly, which is where that spring connection comes from with the use of that instrument. So with that context, right, the musical painting like it's done here in Dvaledraumar is effective on two levels. The first level, for those of you who don't know why these particular sounds are being used, It's not needed to enjoy it. You will enjoy it just because it sounds good, it sounds cool, and it definitely creates that strong neo-folk ambiance. But at the second level, for those who do get the references of the cultural context of Lok and Seljefløte, that adds just one more layer of artistry to love and appreciate about the way that these songs and the album as a work tells its story through both text, lyric, and music. This is, from a compositional standpoint, just one of the coolest tracks that Wardruna has ever done. And it requires a lot of confidence, by the way, to put a 15-minute track like this in the middle of an album. And it pays off immensely. So as I said, Jord to Ljos transitions cleanly from Dvaledraumar off of the momentum of the building spring soundscape, using the Tretale, again the musical character of the bear, to mark the bear's emerging from hibernation to walk the landscape once more. I can literally feel the warmth on my skin of that first day of spring when I listen to this track. But as a side note, it's funny how short a 5-minute song feels after coming off of the 15-minute Dvaledraumar, and thus ends the song cycle of the last 3 tracks, some of my favorite music in Wardruna's whole discography before we start bringing it on home. So I pretty much have all of the same feelings about Himinndotter as I did in the initial video I did a few months ago. It's cinematic, it's majestic, and I like the way that it poses that question of uncertainty at the end of the song with that final note on an incomplete cadence. But of course, my favorite part of this track is Lindy's vocal solo in the middle that really does feel primal in all of the right ways, giving the song something it would have been missing otherwise. The addition of the choir too was just a great choice, a great call, adding even more to that grand scope that the piece has. Check out that video if you want more on this song in particular. Hibjørnen is the track that sticks with you. It's the one that takes everything that is behind Birna and distills it to its most base essence. The song was the one that stuck out to me the most of all the singles. It's the one I found myself thinking about the most and reflecting on even now all this time later and after all these repeated listens, both of the single alone and of the album in its entirety. It has a beauty to it that sets it apart from a lot of Wardruna's music because of that warmth that's been characterizing Birna, but also combined with the simplicity and the rawness of these skaldic performances that Einar has been, crafting and perfecting over the course of his career. And the lyrics alone lull me into that mossy dream space that the music video clearly wants me to be in, and the softer, more major inflected refrain highlights that vulnerability that I mentioned at the top of the video. All around, Hibjørnen is my favorite composition on this album and the one that I keep going back to the most. It's the one that sticks with me. But it also shows Einar in particular at his strongest as a composer, an artist, and a performer. So bear with me, get it, as I think aloud here. I've had this album for a few months now. Listened to it repeatedly, had a lot of time to mull this over. But I feel like Birna proper ends with Hibjørnen. It started when I kept thinking, man, this song would be so much better as the album closer. A quiet, reflective song like this at the end of an album is usually quite powerful. But then I realized that I think it does end the Birna portion of the album that exact way. Because there is a through line from the title track throughout Hibjørnen that is heavily threaded with the album's concept. But then after Hibjørnen, we have these 3 songs left, none of which are bear-themed. One is a banger about the Grim or the Death Horse, the other is a single we've been loving since 2020, and Tretale is related by way of being tree and forest themed, and is my favorite of the 3, but we'll get to that. But all 3 feel like they're doing their own thing. I think I'm just bringing this up because I'm curious to know if it's just me that feels this way. I want to know how you guys feel, but there's definitely a change of pace after Hibjørnen. Almost as if these 3 songs lay beyond the dramatic contour from Hertan through Hibjørnen. That's not to say these 3 songs aren't good, far from it. I feel like a lot of really cool new ideas are shown in these tracks, but they do kind of feel like a postlude. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear if I am just the only one that feels this way. Skuggehesten rips. I love this track. It has a good pulsing, snarling energy to it, and I love the way that is that an organistrum, emulates a metal riff way down low without the distortion. But the chorus opens up to a more beautiful, soaring character that makes the track well-rounded and dynamic. It's funny, but I can't really think of any other track on any Wardruna album that sounds quite like Skuggehesten. Maybe you guys can help me out here. But as I said, an absolute banger that will no doubt feature on many a playlist. So, I may be reading too much into this like a proper musicologist, but the track is called Voice of the Trees, and the foremost sound that you hear throughout the song is the sound of rustling leaves. It's more of that sound painting that I talked about with Dvaledraumar, using recorded sound that wouldn't typically be considered musical, but in a musical way. That kind of music concrete, as maybe we could call it, also really drives home the animist or even transcendental message of the album, in that the world has its own music that we have just forgotten how to listen to. I just think it's a really creative and clever touch that adds a layer to Tretale that also makes this track stick with me from an artistic standpoint. But I also don't want to overshadow my actual favorite part of this track, and one of my favorite parts of the album in general, which is the chanting chorus halfway through the song. Tretale gives me very strong Bruna Ljos Yggdrasil vibes, which are always welcome, as that album is probably one of my favorites outside of Hibjørnen. And lastly, we have Lyfjaberg. What is there really to say about this track that we've had since even before Hibjørnen? I was surprised to see this song on the album with that fact in mind, but it's true that it didn't have a home before this. So considering Birna's theme, it was probably the best fit for it. To this day, again talking about the musical use of recorded sound, the use of hiking footsteps to set the marching to rhythm of the song itself, blurring the lines between life, nature, and music in a very intentional way, just really impresses me from a creative standpoint, starting a song about a mountain. And of course, one of the fan favorite choruses of any Wardruna song at the concerts, I do think it was a good pick to end the album on Lyfjaberg if it wasn't going to be Hibjørnen. So you guys know that I have been pointing out the dark folk and pagan genre's narrowing expressive range for practically as long as this has been a YouTube channel. As someone who loves the genre, it's always kind of bothered me how reluctant artists are in exploring emotional ranges beyond the doom and gloom. And I've always wanted musicians to try and open up a little bit more to see what other emotions can be explored in this music style. Einar put it best in challenging the bear as a hyper-masculine figure typical to the Viking sphere, right? We have plenty of odes and homages to the ferocity and savagery of the bear through the big bad berserker. But what can we gain if we instead gave more attention to the symbol of the bear as a mother, which has gone completely underexplored in this sphere of music? The simple reframing of the bear's character begins, of course, at the name of the album itself, hiding in plain sight, the feminine Birna as opposed to the more typical Hibjørn. But also, of course, in the art accompanying this album, like the merch that's focusing on like the cubs and the nurturing mother, all of the iconography that is focusing on the feminine side of the bear as opposed to the masculine. And this is the very reason I latched on to the warmth and vulnerability of Birna from the outset of this deep dive. Look at what such a simple reframing of how we understand an animal through tropes changes about how we understand it and what we learn from it. As a central argument to Birna as a rhetorical work of art that Einar talked about in our conversation back in October, Wardruna makes a pretty damn good case for it. If this is what comes from such a reframing from the aggressive and the violent to the nurturing and caring, think of what else can be said through this style of music if more were to take this same approach. Considering the indisputable scope of Wardruna's influence, the fact that this band has now given to the world an album with these emotional and expressive dimensions previously overlooked in the very genre that they have defined over the last decade is hopefully a sign of things to come for a development or growth in this style that I think is long overdue. We all need to mourn. We all need to grieve. We do. But what do we do after we grieve? After we mourn? After we get the anger out? As it stands, this style of Viking or pagan folk, or whatever name you prefer, struggles to look beyond the grief and the anger. But to live only for grief becomes oppressive and self-defeating. And that's what makes Birna such a powerful work of art. It does look beyond the grief. There's a hope to it, an optimism that, while difficult to hold in spite of everything that's going on, we should hold on to it nonetheless, because the natural world beyond humans depends on us to do so. That's why Birna really is an animist manifesto. It looks forward to what we need to do, understands the hurt of the presence, and argues for the beauty in the world around us while also reminding us what's at stake if we lose it. A powerful message that's needed now more than ever, and one that needs as many voices as it can find. Thank you for watching.